Good morning, students. In this week's lesson, we will be looking at structured essay question skills, specifically at the explain type of questions. Now, this skill is not new to you because in Sec 1, you have already been exposed to an explain type of SEQ question. So the first part of today's lesson, we will be doing some revision, okay, to refresh your mind on how to approach explain type of SEQ question, and then we will get to practice and put into action the skills when we look at one of the SEQ question. Now, when we look at an explain type of question, what does it actually assesses you on? So an explain type question assesses you on two things. The first one being how well you actually understand your content, and number two, are you able to explain your content points in such a way that links back to the issue of the question. Now, an explain type question differs from a describe type question in the sense that a describe type question only assesses you on your content knowledge. That is why an explain type question is 6 marks, simply because it actually requires more thinking processes on your end. Now, how do you start an explain type SEQ? 3 simple steps. The first step, you have to identify the issue in the question, meaning what is the question actually asking you about? Once you have done so, the second step would be actually to brainstorm on the content that you have learned in class, that your teachers have actually gone through with you, and to actually think about what would be the relevant content points to answer the question, ATQ. I will be using this acronym pretty frequently, so whenever I say ATQ, it would refer to answer the question. Now, after you have brainstormed on the content and what would be relevant, step 3 would be the last step, where you would have to organize your answer in a pew approach. So what exactly is the pew approach? Pew stands for point, elaboration, explanation, and link. Right? So point, okay, the first relevant content point that actually ATQs. Once you have identified that, you would then elaborate on the content of it. Okay, as part of your elaboration, we also do expect you to be able to give examples to substantiate this content. After that, you move on to explanation. How does the content answer the issue? Once that is done, you would actually link everything that you have written back to the issue in the question, and this is where you can actually use connectors such as therefore, as a result, hence. Now all this is very theoretical, okay, so to actually understand it better, we would like to apply it to a question. So earlier on, you have been actually given an SEQ assignment with this question. Explain why the British decided to introduce constitutional changes in Singapore after 1945. Now, let me introduce to you and go through how to analyze this question together as a class. Okay, so the first thing we do is we would identify the issue in the question. So what is the question asking about? Okay, you see that it is actually asking you on the reasons for introducing constitutional changes in Singapore. Step 2, brainstorm on the content that we have learned in class. So what content have we learned with regards to constitutional changes in Singapore? We have talked about external developments as well as internal developments that have actually impacted the British decision to introduce constitutional changes. What are the sub-points under external developments? Point number 1, increasing independence movements in other countries. Point number 2, rise of communist threat. On the other hand, internally, we have learned and understood content such as the rise of political consciousness among locals, as well as the loss of British superiority. So, if you take a look at this, we actually have 4 different content points that we can use. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, how many points do we need to PEL in an explain type question? Okay, an explain type SEQ is worth 6 marks at SEQ 2, and you will need to PEL 2 content points. So let's take a look, okay, at the handout and go through this particular question together, right? So we have actually given you a sample response, and let's look through the sample response together. Okay, so now, let's focus on here. Now the point that we have chosen to use is, the rise of political consciousness. So how do you actually start your answer? Now the question asks you, explain why the British decided to introduce constitutional changes. So I can start my paragraph by saying, one of the reasons why the British decided to introduce constitutional changes was the rise of political consciousness among locals. So this is my P, my content point. Now after that, the next line, we need to give examples and to elaborate on what is the rise of political consciousness. The information that you include as part of your elaboration is your content that you have actually learned in class and in your notes and in your textbook. Alright, so when we talk about the rise of political consciousness, we can actually say, for example, before the Japanese occupation, people did not question who or how the government ruled them. However, after the Japanese occupation, some began to think of the future of Singapore and question British superiority. So here, this is a good content point to have. After that, people started making more demands for changes in the colonial government. Another good content elaboration point. And you can actually go on to give examples of what you mean by making more demands. In this case, for example, there was more demand for political involvement as there was an increase in the number of political groups that emerged. So here is actually an example of what I mean by people started making more demands. So one example of the political group that emerged was the Malayan Democratic Union, and members actually discussed how they wanted Singapore to be governed. Now up to this point in time, you should not be having any issues or any problems, because what we have done so far is we have actually identified a content point, the ATQs, and we have elaborated on it. Everyone doing okay so far? Now, the next bit, the explanation. Now that is where your thinking needs to come in. So what do I mean by explanation? Now that I have identified the point, the content point, and elaborated on it, I must now explain how the rise of political consciousness actually lead to the British introducing constitutional changes? Okay, so here, okay, let's include that thinking process in words. Okay, let's use a different color font. Okay, let's use blue. So we should be thinking, how did the rise of political consciousness lead to the British granting constitutional changes? Right? So what if people were making more demands for changes? Okay, always think about so what. If you can answer the so what part, that is explanation. Okay, so let's recap. Okay, as part of explanation, we are thinking about how did the rise of political consciousness lead to the British granting constitutional changes. Okay, simply because when there was a rise in political consciousness, the British actually realized that they had to grant more political power to the locals to prevent unrest. Okay, since the people were making more demands, okay, the British realized that if they were to not give in to the demands, okay, the people would actually create unrest in order to get their demands met. So as a result, the British wanted to ensure the government was handed to non-communist groups that were willing to work with the British to introduce gradual self-government into Singapore. Okay, right? So on one hand, the British realized that they had to grant more political power to the locals, but at the same time, they wanted to ensure that the political power that was given would be to groups that were willing to work with the British. So this is your key explanation point, right? Had to grant more political power to prevent unrest. Okay, now that I've explained, let's do a final link back to the question. Okay, in this case, I can just simply say, therefore, the rise of political consciousness among locals was one of the reasons why the British decided to introduce constitutional changes. Alright, in here you will see that it is pretty much like a short conclusion, okay, but yet it is a conclusion that you should have, because if you were to end your answer here, okay, for example, if you were to end your answer here, okay, then the marker would not get what you are trying to say. Okay, the marker would most likely be thinking, okay, yes, the British realized they had to grant more political power, and then so, right, and to, okay, go around that, okay, to circumvent that, okay, therefore there is a need for a link, right, and this is, okay, that very short conclusion that links back to the entire question. Are you able to follow the lesson thus far? Alright, okay, you should not have too much of a problem, okay, because like I said right at the start of this podcast, this is not a new skill. You have actually done this in secondary 1, okay? Now that I've actually completed a first sample response for you, your task, okay, would be actually to write the second Q out. Okay, so it's now your turn, right? We have earlier talked about the 4 possible points, the 4 possible content points. Okay, just to show you again, these are the 4 possible content points. I've actually already, okay, discussed this first point, rise of political consciousness. So you actually have 3 other points that you could possibly write about. Okay, increasing independence movements in other countries, the rise of communist threat, and or the loss of British superiority. Okay, whichever point that you choose to peel, okay, remember you would have to actually link back to the issue in the question. So for example, okay, if we talk about increasing independence movements in other countries, you must be able to explain how this event actually forced the British to actually introduce constitutional changes. Clear? Alright, so please fill in, okay, the rest of the handout on your own and submit to your respective history teachers, okay, via their preferred submission mode. Okay, I hope that you have actually understood and followed the lesson thus far. Okay, if you have any questions, okay, please contact your respective history teachers, and I am sure they are more than willing to actually help you out. Alright, thank you students, and have a very nice day ahead.